All right, so today we're diving into some pretty murky waters, the always kind of murky waters of U.S.-Taiwan relations. It always feels murky to me anyway.
Always.
Um, and you sent over some really interesting stuff. It looks like we're going to be looking at this through the eyes of Austin Dahmer, former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense under Trump.
Right.
So buckle up, everybody. This is going to be a fun one.
Yeah, definitely going to be a wild one.
So to unpack this a little bit, we're going to be primarily relying on the analysis and commentary of Taiwanese political commentator Zhang Zhuji.
Right.
So he's got some interesting thoughts on this, and Dahmer's perspective, which has definitely stirred the pot a little bit.
Definitely has.
So set the stage for me. What exactly is causing all this commotion?
Yeah, so Dahmer's put forward this idea that while defending Taiwan is important, it shouldn't be considered an existential interest for the U.S., which is kind of a loaded term.
Yeah.
And he's saying that the potential cost of directly defending Taiwan might actually outweigh the benefits.
Yeah.
Especially when considering China's growing power.
Okay, so that's pretty provocative right there. I
Yeah.
mean, isn't the U.S. kind of committed to defending Taiwan?
Well, yeah, that's where things get complicated.
Yeah.
His argument is really that the U.S. needs to prioritize its resources to counter China's rise more broadly.
Okay.
And he thinks that directly confronting China might be a more effective strategy than indirectly trying to deter them through actions like aiding Ukraine.
Okay.
To illustrate his point, he used this really interesting analogy. He says the U.S. has a greater interest in Mexico than Madagascar.
Right.
Similarly, Taiwan is important, but not vital to U.S. survival.
So he's saying that focusing on containing China, rather than getting bogged down in these peripheral conflicts, is the smarter play.
Yeah, exactly. And his concern is that if the U.S. pours all of its resources into defending Taiwan, it could weaken its overall military strength, potentially allowing China to dominate Asia in the long run.
Okay.
He even asks this pretty provocative question. You know, if defending Taiwan cripples the U.S. military and allows China to eventually dominate Asia anyway, was it even worth it?
Yeah, that's,
Yeah.
I mean, it's a good question. It's a very uncomfortable question to kind of wrestle with, but it seems like he's challenging the conventional wisdom about U.S. involvement in the region.
Oh, absolutely he is. And it's important to note that this stance has sparked quite a bit of debate. One person who's pushed back against Dahmer's claims is Eric Sayers, a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute.
Okay. And what are Sayers' main concerns with Dahmer's stance?
Well, Sayers argues that publicly questioning Taiwan's importance to the U.S. could undermine deterrence efforts and make it harder to rally allies in the region. He's worried that statements like this could embolden China to act more aggressively, thinking that the U.S. might not actually intervene.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's like this weird tightrope walk, isn't it? Like trying to be strategic and realistic without sending the wrong signal.
It is a total tightrope walk.
Yeah.
And, Dahmer's counter-argument is that by being more transparent and realistic about the situation, that the U.S. can avoid costly mistakes driven by emotion or outdated assumptions.
Okay.
And he thinks this will lead to smarter choices regarding resource allocation and overall strategy.
I see where he's coming from there. So what does Dahmer propose the U.S. do instead of solely focusing on defending Taiwan?
Well, he really emphasizes that the U.S. shouldn't shoulder the burden of defending Taiwan alone. And he points to two key factors that could make defending Taiwan too costly for the U.S. The first one is a delayed U.S. military modernization that allows China to catch up. And then the second factor is a lack of willingness on the part of the Taiwanese people to defend themselves.
Okay, so he's placing a lot of emphasis on Taiwan stepping up their own defenses. I mean, is that really a realistic expectation?
That's a key question, Ed.
Yeah.
To kind of illustrate his point about the internal challenges Taiwan faces, he brings up this rather unsettling example. A former Taiwanese lieutenant general who was caught spying for China and was allegedly organizing an armed resistance group within Taiwan.
Oh, wow.
So it highlights these complex internal dynamics.
Wow, so it's not just about, ships and planes. It's also about the will to resist.
It's about the internal dynamics, the will to resist, exactly.
Yeah.
And this leads us to kind of how Dahmer's views compare to the current administration's stance on Taiwan. Zhang argues that Dahmer's approach echoes a distinctly Trumpian view, which differs from the Biden administration's more common rhetoric on defending Taiwan.
Interesting. So how do their approaches differ?
Well, according to Zhang, the key distinction is really in their ultimate goals. Trump, and by extension, Dahmer prioritized defeating China strategically. Biden's focus, on the other hand, seems to be more on simply protecting Taiwan from attack.
Okay.
Zhang believes that directly countering China's rise would be more effective. in ensuring Taiwan's safety than simply promising to defend it if attacked.
Okay, so proactively weakening your opponent versus reacting to their aggression.
Yeah, exactly.
So where does Dahmer ultimately land on all of this? Does he see any hope for Taiwan?
He concludes that even if Taiwan were to fall to China,
Yeah.
preventing Chinese hegemony in Asia would still remain the U.S.'s core goal.
Yeah.
However, he acknowledges that this goal would become much more challenging and costly.
Mm-hmm.
He really emphasizes that the U.S. must make strategic choices based on a clear-eyed assessment of its interests and capabilities.
So he's not advocating for abandoning Taiwan completely, but rather for a more strategic and nuanced approach to its defense.
Precisely.
Oh, okay.
He's urging a shift away from simplistic narratives and toward a more pragmatic long-term strategy.
This is already so much to unpack, and I feel like we're just scratching the surface. I'm really curious to see how this all connects to the bigger picture. What do you think? Does Dahmer offer any concrete solutions?
He does, and that's what we'll get into next. His recommendations are sure to spark even more debate.
Yeah, so Dahmer does offer some specific recommendations, and they really revolve around strengthening the U.S. military presence in the Indo-Pacific region.
He argues for increased investment in new technologies, modernizing existing weapon systems, and bolstering alliances with key partners like Japan, South Korea, and Australia.
So basically, creating a stronger deterrent force. That would make China think twice about any aggressive actions.
Exactly.
But wouldn't that be incredibly costly?
It would be a significant investment for sure. But Dahmer argues that it's necessary to prioritize resources and make strategic choices. He believes that spreading U.S. forces too thin across multiple commitments weakens the overall strategy.
That makes sense. It's about focusing on what truly matters in the long run. But didn't we hear earlier that some experts disagree with this approach? Specifically, Sayers expressed concerns about sending the wrong message to China and potentially undermining alliances.
You're absolutely right. Sayers argues that signaling any willingness to potentially abandon Taiwan, even rhetorically, risks damaging U.S. credibility and weakening those critical alliances. He believes that a strong and unwavering commitment to Taiwan is essential for deterring China.
So it's like a balancing act between projecting strength and avoiding provocation.
Yeah.
How does Dahmer address this concern?
Well, Dahmer counters that an unconditional commitment to defend Taiwan, no matter the circumstances, could actually lead to a more dangerous situation. If China perceives the U.S. as obligated to intervene, it might be tempted to test that commitment, potentially sparking a conflict that neither side truly wants.
That's a really interesting point. So it seems like there's this fine line between deterrence and escalation.
Exactly. And this is a classic dilemma in international relations, how to project strength without inadvertently provoking the very conflict you're trying to avoid.
Right. So if Dahmer's suggesting a less absolute commitment from the U.S., where does that leave Taiwan?
Well, he stresses that the U.S. cannot be solely responsible for Taiwan's defense. He strongly advocates for Taiwan to bolster its own military capabilities and demonstrate a clear willingness to resist any aggression from China.
But is that a realistic goal for Taiwan? I mean, they're facing a much larger and more powerful adversary.
It's certainly a challenging task. But Dahmer believes it's essential for Taiwan's long-term survival. He specifically recommends increasing defense spending, investing in what are called asymmetric warfare capabilities, and strengthening the reserve forces.
Could you explain what asymmetric warfare capabilities means? It sounds pretty technical.
Sure. It essentially refers to strategies and tactics that exploit an adversary's weaknesses, rather than trying to match them in terms of conventional military power.
Okay.
Think of it as using unconventional methods to level the playing field.
So instead of trying to go toe-to-toe with China's massive military, Taiwan would focus on strategies that play to their strengths and exploit China's vulnerabilities.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Things like cyber warfare, mobile missile systems, and guerrilla tactics could be particularly effective for a smaller force facing a larger opponent.
That makes sense. It's about being strategic and adaptable, rather than trying to win a head-on confrontation.
Yes, and it also requires fostering a strong sense of national unity and preparing the population for the possibility of conflict. This societal resilience can make a huge difference in deterring aggression and resisting invasion.
So it sounds like Dahmer is putting a lot of responsibility on Taiwan to step up and take ownership of their own defense. Do you think the Taiwanese people are ready for that?
That's a crucial question, Adia. Interestingly, Zhang, in his analysis, highlights a growing sentiment within Taiwan that the U.S. might not actually come to its rescue if China attacks. He suggests this could be a result of the perceived shift in U.S. policy, under the Biden administration, away from the more confrontational approach favored by Trump.
So there's a growing sense of uncertainty in Taiwan about
Right.
the future of U.S. support.
Yeah.
Wow.
And that uncertainty could have significant consequences. If Taiwan believes it's on its own, it might be more likely to make concessions to China, or even consider unification as a way to avoid conflict.
This whole situation is so complex. It feels like every action, every statement has ripple effects across the entire region.
You're absolutely right, and that's why Dahmer's perspective is so important to consider. He's urging both the U.S. and Taiwan to think strategically about their relationship and take concrete steps to ensure Taiwan's long-term security and prosperity.
Okay, so it's clear that he's not advocating for abandoning Taiwan, but instead he's calling for a more nuanced and realistic approach, recognizing the complexities of the situation and avoiding simplistic solutions.
Exactly.
Okay.
He's pushing for a more pragmatic and forward-thinking strategy that focuses on long-term goals and avoids getting bogged down in reactive measures.
Man, this has been a fascinating conversation and honestly kind of a sobering one. We've been talking about all this high-level policy stuff, but I keep wondering what this actually means for like the average person in Taiwan. What's their perspective on this whole situation?
Yeah, that's a really important point. And I think for a lot of people in Taiwan, there's this growing sense of unease. They're caught in this really precarious position, trying to balance maintaining their autonomy and democratic values while facing this increasing pressure from China.
Yeah, they're really stuck in the middle of this
Exactly.
geopolitical tug of war.
And as we've been discussing it, Dahmer's analysis suggests that relying solely on the U.S. for protection might not be a viable long-term strategy.
Right.
So if you're in Taiwan, you got to start thinking about other options.
So let's try to put ourselves in their shoes for a second. What are those options? What can they realistically do to ensure their own security and future?
Well, one option, as Dahmer has pointed out, is to significantly strengthen their own defenses.
Yeah.
Make it crystal clear to China that any attempt to take Taiwan by force would be met with fierce resistance.
Yeah.
And come at a really high cost.
Yeah, that makes sense. But
Right.
Isn't that a pretty daunting task?
Yeah.
Taiwan is a relatively small island, and they're facing this massive and increasingly powerful adversary in China.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a total David and Goliath situation.
Yeah.
And that's why Dahmer really emphasizes the importance of those asymmetric warfare capabilities that we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
It's about using your strengths to exploit weaknesses
Right.
rather than trying to match China's raw military power.
Right. So focusing on things like cyber warfare, mobile missile systems, guerrilla tactics, the kinds of things that can disrupt and deter a much larger force.
Exactly.
Right.
But it's not just about military hardware and tactics. It's also about strengthening what's called social resilience.
Okay.
So that means fostering a strong sense of national unity, preparing the population for the possibility of conflict, and developing a really robust civil defense infrastructure.
So it's about creating a society that's resilient and prepared to resist aggression on multiple fronts,
Precisely.
not just militarily.
And this is where Dahmer's point about the willingness of the Taiwanese people to defend themselves becomes super critical. If the will to resist is strong and unwavering, it makes any potential invasion much more challenging and costly for China.
Because even if you're outmatched technologically, a determined population can inflict a lot of damage.
Absolutely.
Make an aggressor think twice.
And don't forget the role of international diplomacy. Taiwan needs to continue building those strong relationships with other democracies around the world, fostering economic ties, promoting cultural exchanges.
So it's about building this network of support, making it clear that an attack on Taiwan would have global repercussions.
Exactly.
So it's this complex game with all these moving pieces, and it doesn't sound like there are any easy answers.
No easy answers.
But it does sound like Dahmer's insights provide a valuable framework for thinking about the challenges and the potential paths forward. For Taiwan,
I think so.
man, this deep dive has been a real eye-opener for me. It's clear that there are no simple answers here, and the stakes are incredibly high.
Yeah, they really are. And that's why it's so important to keep having these conversations, to challenge those assumptions, and to consider all these different perspectives. The future of Taiwan is not set in stone. It really depends on the choices made by Taiwan, China, the U.S., and the other players in the region.
And those choices are going to have a profound impact on a lot of people.
Absolutely. For anyone listening, I really encourage you to check out the sources that we've talked about today and come to your own conclusions. What role can the international community play in promoting peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait? It's a question that deserves a lot of thought and one that we'll definitely revisit in future deep dives.
Well, thank you so much for walking us through all of this. It's been a really thought-provoking conversation.
It's been my pleasure.